want to thank our panelists. We are planning on having a webinar for the next hour based around COVID-19 and the vaccines and the impact on workplace and employment. So for that, I'm very pleased to have a very esteemed panel of experts to discuss the medical, legal, political, employer perspectives on these issues. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Kirsty Short, Senior Lecturer of School of Chemistry and Molecular Biosciences at University of Queensland. That's a mouthful, Doctor. Thank you very much for joining us. Nerida Jessup, Special Counsel from Herbert Smith Freehills. Thanks for joining us, Nerida. Larry Anthony, the Honourable Larry Anthony, immediate past President of the Federal Nationals and an ex-Federal Minister. Thanks for joining us, Larry. And Gareth O'Reilly, Zone President, Managing Director Pacific at Schneider Electric. Thank you very much, Gareth. Just before we get into the questions, I think it's fair to say COVID and lockdowns, border closures and the vaccination is the hottest topic of today, affecting every one of our lives. Just for your information, I've checked this morning, there are over 237 million cases of COVID-19 recorded around the world, with 4,848,000 deaths recorded against the disease so far. Within Australia, we have got 120,000 cases, 23,400 of those are currently active, and we have recorded 1,389 deaths, unfortunately. We have administered 29 million vaccines so far, which is 81% of over 16s have got one dose, and 59.3% of over 16s have received 2 doses. So I'm quite pleased to present this webinar. I will just remind the members who have joined us that you can have the opportunity to pose some questions to our experts today. I'd encourage you just to, we'll get some opening statements from each of our experts, and then if you have a question you don't think we're going to answer, click on the Q&A tab and pop it in there, and then I'll go through those and try and collate them and put them to our experts later in the webinar. So I will throw to our medical expert, Dr. Short, first, just to get a real background on COVID. Can you tell us about the virus? How does it affect people? Why is it so deadly? How does the Delta strain compare with the original virus? And is it inevitable that we will all get exposed to it sooner or later?
Yeah, so COVID in a nutshell, essentially.
Yes. Tell us everything.
Yeah, sure. So I think we're all familiar with the basics of coronavirus or COVID-19 and how it spreads. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that there's a very broad spectrum of disease. So some individuals will get a mild infection, whereas some individuals will get a severe infection. We now know quite well some of the factors that are associated with a severe infection, things like old age, and I'm talking not that old. Basically, once you get over 50, your risk increases. Males, unfortunately. Then we know things like diabetes, obesity, all those things increase the risk of severe COVID. And when I talk about severe COVID, do not think that this is flu. I've worked on flu for most of my career. And if you look at the lungs of a COVID patient and you can take them out and you can actually look at them in a lab, they are so destroyed, they do not even look like lungs. If you showed them to me blind, I couldn't tell you that they were lungs. I would think maybe it's a piece of liver or something like that. That's how decimating the virus can be. The problem we have with this virus on top of this is that even though the young may get a mild initial infection, we now know that there's a phenomenon called long COVID, whereby individuals continue to suffer various signs and symptoms of COVID as little as 4 weeks post-infection, all the way up to 1.5 years post-infection. This occurs even if you had a mild initial acute infection, and we're actually doing a study on this. So talking to patients with long COVID, we're hearing testimonials from people who were young, healthy healthcare workers who contracted the virus in the first wave in Melbourne, who still a year later cannot go back to work because they simply don't have the energy. So this is, I cannot emphasize it enough, a serious disease for everyone. We have variants emerging with COVID-19. There's lots of different variants and it gets very confusing with the naming. Even us virologists get confused. The one we're focused on now is Delta, because that seems to be the dominant variant in the world. We know that Delta is much more transmissible than the original ancestral virus. It's still very controversial as to whether this virus actually causes more severe disease than the initial ancestral virus, and that's something that we're actually actively researching, but we do know that it's more transmissible. The other thing and the other problem, I suppose, we've had in parts of Australia is that we've been victims of our own success. In Queensland, in WA, in South Australia, we haven't really had widespread COVID outbreaks. So we don't really know what it's like to go through that. And if you talk to friends and colleagues who've gone through that in Melbourne, in Sydney, but also overseas, these are pretty horrific times when you have, basically, I've talked to a clinician colleague in Indonesia who at one point in the pandemic, their hospital ran out of room to store the bodies and they were renting cooler trucks that were just lined up outside the hospital to put the bodies in. So with all that in mind, at some point, we are going to have to open borders and we are going to have to let COVID in because we cannot stay with our borders shut forever. That's just not feasible. The difference is, do you want to get COVID as an unvaccinated, vulnerable individual and sign yourself up for all those consequences that I talked about? Or do you want to get it as a vaccinated individual where even if you do get an infection, it will be mild, your risk of long COVID is low, and importantly, you're at a very, very low risk of having to go to the hospital or dying from the disease?
Look, as a over 50 male, I'm now extra worried from your information, and I'm leaving my office door shut from now on. I have been double vaccinated, which gives me some level of protection, but maybe you can tell me a bit about the vaccine. And you've mentioned to me before your role at UQ is actually researching COVID and developing cures and vaccines. Can you explain the vaccine to us, how it's created? Did we shortcut the testing of the virus or did we just speed it up? How does the vaccine reduce the risk of transmission or death? And how would you rate the different vaccines? I've taken AstraZeneca. Should I get a Pfizer top-up later? What's the latest on that?
Yeah, so the essential way any vaccine works is it tricks your body into thinking that you've had the infection without getting you sick. So basically it means that your immune system mounts the appropriate response as if there'd been an infection, but you don't have all the consequences of, having to go through the illness itself. Now, there's different variants of these COVID-19 vaccines that work on different platforms, but that's the fundamental principle across the board. Vaccination, incredibly, and I think people don't realize how incredible this is we've got multiple really good vaccines against COVID, okay? It is really tough to make a vaccine, and to get multiple good vaccines against a virus, it puts us in a really good position. Some people have been really concerned that they were done too fast because it is the fastest time we've brought a vaccine from development to market. But I think what people need to realize is, first of all, we in the virology field knew a pandemic was coming. This was not a surprise. I actually have in my house a designated pandemic box that I've had for the last few years, knowing that a pandemic was coming. I haven't used my pandemic box yet, but it's still there just in case. So this was not a surprise. We knew that we needed vaccines, and specifically vaccine platforms that could be rapidly adapted in the context of an outbreak. So it's not that this research represents 1 year of research. This actually represents about 20 years of vaccine research. On top of that, what you normally do when you're developing a vaccine is you do something like a phase 1 trial, you then collect the data, you present the data, you go around to funders, try and get somebody interested, then you can get funding for a phase 2 trial, go around to funders, get funding for a phase 3 trial. And, it's a long process. In this situation, we had so much money being thrown at the vaccines that provided the data looked good, there was no problem progressing on to the next stage of the trial. And then the final thing to note is that actually manufacturers took an incredible financial risk with these vaccines. Normally, manufacturers only start manufacturing a vaccine at the very, very end. Once it's all been approved, everything is good to go, and then they will start the manufacturing process. Here we have manufacturers start manufacturing basically around phase 1. Now, this is an incredible risk to a manufacturer, because it means potentially they're generating thousands and millions of vaccines that will never be used. But it is preventing a lag at the end of the vaccine making process. So what you'll note with all of these is that these are ways to create shortcuts or shorten that time, but at no point is any of the safety or the efficacy compromised. They all remain very, very tightly regulated. We have different vaccines available now in Australia. We have Moderna, Pfizer, and of course AstraZeneca. AstraZeneca obviously copped a lot of bad press because of the issue with blood clotting. But for individuals who are over the age of 60, over the age of 50, it depends a bit on the country, who are at low risk of the blood clotting, AstraZeneca is a great vaccine. Pfizer's a great vaccine. Moderna's a great vaccine. And the reason they're all great vaccines is they all have incredibly high efficacy of keeping you out of the hospital and keeping you from dying. And that was the goal. The next generation of vaccines will do things like looking at preventing transmission, and these vaccines already do prevent transmission, just not perfectly, and maybe looking at things like oral administration, so you don't have to have a needle. But the vaccines that we have are incredibly good. And what I've been telling people throughout the pandemic is just get whatever vaccine you can get. So, you know, if you fall into the older age category and you're eligible for AstraZeneca, get AstraZeneca. If you're younger, get Pfizer, get Moderna, get whatever, just get yourself protected.
I think that's amazing information. I'd love for every Australian to hear you explain the virus like that, and the vaccines. I think would remove a lot of the complacency around getting vaccinated if we did. So I might come back to you later. I just want to flip over to Nerida and bring this discussion into the workplace. There's a lot of our members who are small to medium employers, and they've got an obligation to provide a safe workplace. An average electrical contractor's business would require attending people's homes on a regular basis. What advice would you give about giving direction to your workers around the vaccine for their role of going into those workplaces?
Thanks, Malcolm. And I will, just by way of context, say I'm a safety lawyer and I've been incredibly busy throughout the pandemic. You know, this is a really unprecedented time for us, because in the usual course, a community illness or a community virus wouldn't necessarily be seen as a workplace issue. There are exceptions to that, of course. But this is very much seen as a workplace issue. Employers do have an obligation to manage the risk of transmission of COVID in the workplace. And throughout the last 18 months, we've seen many instances of workplace transmission, seeding events. A lot of these events have occurred in the workplace. So employers do have a responsibility to do what is reasonably practicable to manage the risk of transmission to their workers, to their customers, to their suppliers, to anybody entering their workplace. And there is a recognition that vaccination provides the best level of protection. You know, it's seen in safety speak as a higher order control. A workplace gets the benefit of collective vaccination in reducing the level of transmission and reducing the likelihood of serious illness and hospitalisation through people becoming infected with COVID. So there's a few ways that employers should be thinking about the issue of vaccination. For some employers, the issue really has been forced. They've got public health orders in place, which means that they have to comply with the law, make sure their workers are complying with the law, and manage through the employment issues in giving that direction. So that is reasonable for employers to do. And we've seen last night the Victorian Public Health Order published, which has really provided quite a broad mandate across a number of industries and all authorised workers, essentially, that they must be vaccinated with very few exceptions. The issue for employers, particularly employers who are working at who have national operations, is, well, how do we decide what our approach will be? You know, for employers and for businesses who sit outside those somewhat ad hoc public health orders that are in place for high risk industries and in Victoria. What do we do with our workers? Do we do nothing? Do we encourage them and incentivise them to vaccinate? Or do we go that step further and make this a condition of entry or a direction to our workers that they must vaccinate? And then what do we do with those workers? And there will be a proportion of every workplace, and it's a small proportion. I mean, we're working through this issue with a lot of employers at the moment. It's about 5%, sometimes less, who either cannot vaccinate for medical reasons or who are unwilling to vaccinate, who might be hesitant or might otherwise have a conscientious objection to vaccination. There is legal risk in issuing a direction to workers to vaccinate. So the key risks are, of course, if a direction is challenged by a worker, let's say in the context of unfair dismissal, the direction to vaccinate will be examined as to whether it is reasonable and lawful to issue that direction. And there are other discrimination type risks. There are some medical contraindications. So some people are unable to obtain vaccination, and there are, to a lesser extent, potentially some religious objections to vaccination, although I would say all the major religions either are supportive of vaccinations or not, have no clear objection to them. So I think when you're working through the issue of, well, we've got customers, we've got suppliers, we've got workplaces, and we want to ensure the best level of protection, will it be reasonable and lawful for us to make vaccination a condition of employment? There is some guidance which has been issued by the Fair Work Ombudsman, which suggests that employers should take a tiered approach basically to this. There is a 4-tier framework which has been offered by the Fair Work Ombudsman. Right at the top of that is quarantine workers, those very high risk industries where it will, of course, be lawful to issue a mandate to vaccinate. And in fact, government has stepped in for those industries in the most part and said, you're actually required to get your workers to vaccinate. At the very bottom of that, so then there is a tier 3, which is probably a lot of our workers sit within, which is we've got we're facing customers, we're attending workplaces, there is some risk of transmission. The guidance suggests employers should be looking at the risk in each jurisdiction. So looking at issues like, is there current community transmission? Has there been a history of community transmission? And probably more difficult are those workers who are currently working from home. The guidance suggests that it won't be reasonable and lawful to issue them with directions to vaccinate, although employers, you will have seen, some are either stepping around that issue by suggesting, well, you won't be able to come into the office unless you are vaccinated. And then we've got really high profile examples of employers who've just really decided to lead on this issue, like Qantas, and say, it will be a requirement Q1 2022 that you are fully vaccinated, subject to very few exceptions. So the key issues that you would be working through as an employer are, if we are thinking through whether we can issue a vaccination as a condition of employment, what are the reasons for it? It should be risk-based. And then working with your workforce to make sure that you're consulting on that you're providing the necessary accommodations and exceptions, and then working through how you will respond to any challenges to the direction or any legitimate exemption requests, whether we move them out of the workplace, whether we provide additional testing and protection. So there are a few issues to work through because it is a reasonably untested space.
So just more specifically targeting a small electrical contractors business, 5 employees, customer facing, one of the employees does not want to get vaccinated for whatever reason. What should a small business do with that one employee? So today it's not mandated. In Victoria it is, like you've said, if they're out, but in other states they're not. What sort of process should that small employer go through to resolve that situation, shall we say?
The key is engaging with that worker. So for a lot of workers, there's a range of reasons that they might say. We've got a lot of workers who are saying, for example, we're waiting for Novavax, and we don't have a clear indication of whether that will be. So the first step is to understand the reasons why, whether we can assist and support them to be vaccinated, and then work out whether the risk is tolerable, whether they're going to actually be able to perform their work, where you've got household owners saying, I don't want people on site who are vaccinated, and whether from there, if you really do have somebody who is unwilling to be vaccinated, whether there are grounds to deal with that through their employment.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, let's switch over to the political side, Larry, and you're a very experienced political operator before, during and after your political career. I'm just really interested in your point of view on what role will the public play in requiring companies to get vaccinated. We've seen the Victorian government now put some things in place in law. Should we leave it up to the market to drive this, or do we actually need laws in place to drive this vaccination rate across Australia?
Yeah, look, thanks very much, Malcolm. I probably think Nara's probably better to answer some of these legal questions, but it's, I suppose to date it's sort of been voluntary, but in obviously different jurisdictions, as you've just said, authorised workers now in Victoria, they have to be mandated. So I think initially the public wanted to have freedom, but as time's marching on, there's a compromise, and I think the public's beginning to, the majority, not all, are starting to agree that if they want to have certain rights and benefits back, to avoid lockdowns, to get life back to normality, then there may well be compulsions in different workplaces and different circumstances. And I think that's kind of been an evolution. And as was mentioned previously, we've been a victim of our own success, such low COVID rates prior to, let's say, more recent outbreaks in Victoria and New South Wales, where I live in Queensland, and it's been very slow, the uptake, particularly in Western Australia. All of a sudden, that's changing. So I think the real test for governments is that they've been waiting. Well, obviously, they've got to get compliance. We've had issues if you're up in the public policy space, particularly in Victoria, where a lot of these unauthorised demonstrations, people who've either anti-vax, they've been locked up, they're against authoritarian sort of compliance regime. So I think the trick as a politician or a government is to try to, you got to bring the public with you, or let the public lead. And it's been quite difficult, I think, for Australia, unlike some other countries, because we're a federation. There's been different speeds and different state jurisdictions who have basically control over this. And then, of course, you've got the Commonwealth, which has been providing a lot of the financial underwriting and ultimately is responsible for external borders. So just as a bit of a background, I mean, I used to represent an area in northern New South Wales called, areas of Byron Bay. And that's like and to any electricians in Byron, forgive me that maybe on this webinar, but that's the anti-vax capital of Australia. They weren't even prepared to give children whooping coughs. This is 20 years ago. So what do you do in those communities that are still quite reluctant? So I think what you're finding now that is the public, even let's say now the majority of public on the north coast of New South Wales, which is tree changes, sea changes, even they're starting to realise, well, perhaps we've got to change. Maybe we've got to get vaccinated, because then we'll start to get some of our freedoms back. So I think you're seeing now is obviously there's the blunt instrument, like what they've just done now in Victoria, and I think you can, obviously agree with those authorised workers, whether you're in healthcare or construction or freight. But we're seeing now compulsion coming in, even in Queensland with truckies. They've got to, there'll be a certain point this month and next month where they have to be double vaccinated to be able to cross borders. We will see that very soon now when international borders open back up, that you'll have to be double vaccinated. So I think the public have been driving this just as much as legislators have been trying to ensure that they can get compliance and get vaccination rates up.
So, Larry, if I'm not an anti-vaxxer, I believe in the virus and I want to get vaccinated and everything else, we're seeing a different set of rules in each state, and we're seeing conflict between certain state governments and the federal government around issues like border closures and lockdowns. How can we get the country on the same page so we can all move forward with this conflict at that level?
Well, I think we'll all get on the same page when, we've all had double doses. And this is the difficulty because we're a federation. In New South Wales, I know they'll be hitting 80% double dose sometime this month. And that'll be the trigger point then to open up international borders for people from New South Wales. Now that privilege will be denied if you're in Queensland. So I think the issue, Malcolm, has been a lot of politics, unfortunately. I think last year we had a lot of state elections. We had Queensland, we had the Northern Territory, we had Western Australia, we had Tasmania, and the whole COVID issue was central to those campaigns, keeping our citizens safe by keeping borders shut. So that may well have benefited the citizens from a health perspective. And this is where the rub will be with those states in Victoria and New South Wales, which have had a massive uptake in vaccinations because of the COVID crisis. So they'll get to a situation very soon where they can move out of lockdown. And of course, they will be able to do international travel, but what happens with domestic borders? And I think that's still got to play out. And even in Queensland now, the talk is it 80%? Is it 90%? We don't,
I'm going to jump in there. And before I go to Gareth, I want to go back to Dr. Short quickly. If I can put you on the spot here and you're on mute, I'll just remind you to get off that. There has been an argument about whether 80% is enough for Queensland and WA to open. Can we get their medical opinion on what will happen if we had no cases in Queensland, we've got 80% double vaccinated, and we did open the borders to other states? Would our hospital system keep up? Would we be in carnage? Is it going to be enough?
This is a key question. And look, I'm not privy, as a virologist, I'm not privy to the sort of ins and outs of the healthcare system and what the hospitals are indeed capable of. My concern is that we will get COVID cases if we open up. There's no question about that, because 80% is 80% of those who are eligible. So we also have a lot of kids who aren't vaccinated. We also have a lot of people who just are adults and not vaccinated. It is going to be a test. And that's a pretty scary thought. So in my mind, the way to mitigate the risk there is to have more people, as many people as possible vaccinated when we open the borders. So yes, okay, there's this 80% goal, but let's try and exceed that. Let's go 90%, because that's the only protection we have against our hospitals being overwhelmed. And we won't really know what we're facing until we face it. Yeah,
okay. Understand. So that's quite a complex issue, not as simple as this magic 80% everything will be okay. It's still going to lead to probably additional deaths that we could avoid. But then back to you, Larry, that could lead to other issues, business failures, economy downturns and other things to balance that up. So it's not as simple as this is the magic number, move forward.
No, you're right. I think for those states that are in this pandemic, which is Victoria and New South Wales, as horrendous as it has been for those that have either had COVID or have been prevented from their workplace, the strain internally on just being locked up, the roadmap out of those jurisdictions is very clear. There's no choice. Those states that have been quarantined, in particular Western Australia and Queensland, these are difficult choices, and the difficult choices for legislators, because as was just pointed out by Kirsty, is at the moment in Queensland, it's just fantastic. We can move around with freedoms, and whenever that point is, but that point has to come. Whether it's 80% or 90%, we have to integrate back into the economy. And for so many of those sectors which have been denied, if you're in tourism or hospitality, it's been a significant issue, particularly in Queensland. And we know that in other jurisdictions. So I think the test will start to be when international borders get opened. Because the Commonwealth, there's a plan. You had to be double vaccinated. There'll be different freedoms as you come back in. If you can prove that, you can quarantine at home, assuming those trials work out in South Australia and New South Wales. So it's almost like some of these states will be pulled forward, but ultimately those decisions will be up to individual leaders and premiers to make those calls.
Thanks, Larry. I'll just switch over to Gareth now and just bring you in. I just want to get that the large company and international perspective. You've got many people in many different countries around the world. What sort of policies and development work has Schneider had to do to manage the safety of their international workforce, and how does that affect Australia?
Thank you, Malcolm, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And I just want to say thank you to MEA for all the support you've given to your members, because I think the advice and support you've given has been immensely helpful to them. And I think the role of peak bodies in times like this is particularly important. The panel may take exception to me being called an expert, but I might provide a perspective on what your question is. We had the benefit of experience because Kirsty may have had a pandemic response kit there. We had as well. That came from the experience, based on experience of the Middle East respiratory system outbreak, which informed us around what we had to be ready for. I personally was living in Hong Kong at the time. We had the SARS outbreak, which was a particularly scary time. So I think through those, this is not our first rodeo. And through that, you learn how to manage what a pandemic response plan is. We had, in fact, a pandemic response plan on the shelf, which was rapidly deployed. Now, as you said, we're in many different countries, many different jurisdictions, but we held true to a few things, which is a few principles. First, this is, Narita, you touched on it, this is a safety issue. It is a health issue. So it was about making sure that our people, our customers, our operations were safe. So that informed us around how we prepared for that, how our own experts, or the experts we call them, and I think that's the key thing here is you need to listen to experts. You need to listen to people who have insight on how to manage this. We have about 200 factories around the world. We operate in almost every corner of the world, as you said, Malcolm, including 2 factories here in Australia, as well as a large field population that operate in critical facilities. So we needed to make sure our people were safe, our customers are safe. The other principle we had is that by the nature of what we do, and by the nature of what all of your members do, Malcolm, is essential service, is that if we don't do what we do, and if your members don't do what they do, the lights go off. So it was very critical to make sure that industry operated, that healthcare facilities operated, that our data networks operated, and so on. So again, the principle of operating to that was key. Then we had to respect local conditions, be it legal, be it political, or condition. So that meant working within the jurisdictions that we operated in, and that's a wide and broad church. So we talked today about the broad church that the Federation presents and some of the challenges within that. You can imagine what that looked like when we dealt with Singapore compared to Indonesia, with very different circumstances and everywhere in between. So we had to be ensuring that we were compliant with, but also making sure that we were doing the right thing. For us, we couldn't rely on local environment. And that included here, by the way, in an environment where PPE was not necessarily on call. We had to make sure that we had our own. We had to make sure that we provided facilities for our staff. And in some cases, making sure our factories kept running meant we actually had to have separate ways of ensuring our people could get vaccinated, because whilst we may have been a little bit slow on the uptake, we certainly now have no problem with access to vaccines. And in many of the jurisdictions, we have to make sure that we have vaccination clinics within our operations to make sure that people would be looked after. It's certainly a wide range of what we had to deal with, and making sure that all of those things were in place. The other aspect of this, we've spoken a lot about the consequences of COVID, and Kirsty has certainly shared the very serious consequences of this. We also had to be conscious of what the mental health of our people was. So a lot of focus and attention was putting on making sure that people's mental well-being was there. And I know, Malcolm, you've also put a lot of attention on that, because this has been the other consequence of this uncertainty, that we need to be mentally well as physically well to get through this. For us, this is a workplace safety issue, and Narita touched on that. That's why we treat it as a safety issue and workplace health and safety issue. There are a lot of legal consequences of that, which we're working through, as one can imagine. We are strongly urging our teams to get vaccinated. The only way for us to serve our customers, the only way for us to operate and for us to be a healthy business is that. And I'm pleased to say that we've surveyed our teams and they've come back with a strong response to say that they will. I think the 3 or 4% hesitancy is probably a number that we've had feedback on. And we have to then, to Narita's comment, then work through what that means for us. And it's really role-based or persona-based. Sorry, Malcolm.
So I was just going to ask quickly how Australia's faring. So you operate across a number of countries. Melbourne's the most locked down city in the world, and Australia's dodged a lot of COVID. From your perspective, how has Australia dealt with COVID compared to other countries, or what has been the best country's response to COVID that you've seen?
I don't think there's any best. I think there's just been different approaches. We've been lucky, yes, in that we've managed to flatten, and let's not forget what initially the attempt here is, to flatten the curve so the healthcare system wasn't crushed. And I've seen what a healthcare system looks like when it's crushed, and it's not good. It's been, Kirsty touched on it in Indonesia, but we saw that in the United States, we saw that in the UK. And when people are dying because they can't get access to medical facilities in a first world country is a real eye-opener. And we saw that. And sadly, we did lose colleagues because of that. So I think we need to respect that. And people in what would be called low risk categories as well. So I think that brought it home for us. In terms of vaccination response, healthcare response, you know, the exemplars are probably Singapore and Israel that we've seen. The UK after its initial response. But the other thing I would say is that has to be managed here as well is a living with mindset, not neglecting a health concern. We need to get vaccinated, and I encourage, if you can, that you should. But we also have to look to what we do in our workplaces to make sure that we can work safely. And that's when we get into the challenge that Narita has touched upon around different roles. But for us, our customers are mandating that we must.
Absolutely. So I'm going to come back to Narita, because I've got a couple of good member questions here, and I'll throw the first two at you. I knew you'd get more questions than anyone else in this, but I'll try and share them around. So 2 questions or 3 questions from Liz quickly. Can employers prohibit unvaccinated workers from attending the workplace or work functions? What if more workers refuse to work with unvaccinated co-workers? And that's been an interesting issue. And can employers be liable if an employee has an adverse reaction to the vaccine? So there's a whole bundle of questions, if you can give us some comments there.
I'll start at the bottom. Can employers be liable? Yes, employers can be liable. There certainly might resound in a workers' compensation claim if employers are either requiring or encouraging workers to become vaccinated. There is scope for them to make a claim under the workers' comp no fault scheme. The federal government has announced and actually opened up a claims process for a no fault vaccination compensation scheme, which kind of mirrors the workers' compensation claim process. We haven't seen the detail of that, so we haven't seen the legislation, but it has been announced. There's likely to be a gap between what's covered by the Commonwealth Government scheme and what's covered by workers' compensation scheme. So yes, we should assume there's some level of liability, but it is less likely to resound in common law type claims, although, you know, there is potential. This is all an unknown, but employers should assume that if there is a vaccine injury, there is potential scope for workers to make claims against them. In relation to the first two questions, those are issues we're working through at the moment. So on the second question, what if workers actually don't want to come to work if they're working with unvaccinated colleagues? It's a really good question. So there is a lot of workers who are being asked to return to the workplace, and they will have kids who are unable to vaccinate, for example, and they are concerned and hesitant about coming back to the workplace if there are lower levels of vaccination, or even, you know, working with somebody who is unvaccinated. Employers need to think about that issue from a few points of view. One is, you know, I think we do need to be sensitive as to the anxiety in the community, and the anxiety about people who are living with elderly people and with kids, and the risk that COVID presents. We're seeing some issues arising where it's almost a bullying situation, you know, where there is a pointing of who's vaccinated and who's not. And a lot of those issues will need to be taken through your usual HR processes. But in general, I think employers are looking at their vaccinated workers and saying, well, what can we do to make them feel comfortable? You know, let's think about them. Let's try to get those vaccination rates up. And in some cases, you know, we'll be saying to workers who don't want to vaccinate, that's fine, but you won't be coming in. So it does take a bit of a nuanced response to dealing with those workers who have concern for their own health and the health of their family. In relation to the first question, which I think goes to, can you impose vaccination as a condition of site entry? And can we say, well, you won't be attending functions if you're not vaccinated? On the first question, if you're imposing vaccination as a condition of site entry, you are in effect issuing a direction to workers to vaccinate. So you will need to make sure that you've worked through those employment issues. You've got a really sound risk-based reason for doing so. You've consulted with workers, you've gone through that process. In relation to the work function issue, that's something we're seeing a lot of, and we're actually seeing it in that office space, which is you won't be in the office and you're not going to be at the Christmas party if you're not providing proof of vaccination. That's somewhat less risk than imposing it as a condition of site entry to the workplace. So yes, there's all of those things are open, but there are legal risks, you know, that, and that's what Gareth no doubt is working through.
Thanks for that. Larry, can I bring you in here? And there's a couple of questions really around, I won't read them out, they're quite long, but really around the power of state governments to do what they've done. So it's been a declared health emergency, as I understand, which is a power that's overridden other normal laws and given the state governments to do things like close borders. We saw Clive Palmer test that. Where do the state governments stand with those powers? And potentially, when will those powers expire? When are they no longer valid? And maybe Dr. Short can come in with some advice around when the pandemic is no longer a pandemic and the governments don't have these powers anymore. What's your position on that, Larry? And you're on mute too, sorry.
Thanks, Malcolm. Well, I don't really have a simple answer to your question. As you pointed out, this did actually go to the High Court in that Palmer case, and that was more an individual wanting to have access into a state. And it was held that they did have that right to prevent people entering the state. Look, I don't think any of this will really be resolved until all states open up, and whatever time frame that is. I think, as I mentioned earlier, one of the drivers will be not so much access across state borders or territory borders, but international access. So you will find a situation where there'll be international boundaries for some states will open up much sooner, potentially, than state jurisdictions. In this case, I'm talking about Western Australia and South Australia. So I think the very fact that if they're true to their word, that once you've got proof of vaccination, you've got a digital passenger declaration, there are more flexible quarantine facilities or arrangements when you come back, let's say for international travel, where you can stay at home for 7 days, then I think you'll find that some of those boundaries on states will start to weaken. But look, at the moment, a lot of the powers are in the jurisdiction of the states, and I don't really see any of that changing quickly. I will say this from a higher point of view. It's critical for the Commonwealth government to have a pretty solid roadmap as we go into the next federal election, and that cycle will start very soon, which has to be held by May. You've also got another state election in South Australia in March. So a lot of the state responses, in some ways, shouldn't be, but you should have to look through that lens as well, and depending on what colour they are. And I know that's probably not what we want to hear, but there is merit to that argument.
Thanks for that. And if I go to you, Dr. Shorten, I think you've already answered this earlier with my question about opening up at 80%, but I've heard the theory, I think it came out of Michaelia Cash's comments one day around, once we get to 80%, the borders have to open up because this is no longer a medical emergency. Do you have an opinion? I think you've already answered that in the negative to me earlier.
Yeah, I think, look, I can't comment on any of the legal requirements or anything here, so I can just contextualize the healthcare requirements. I think we need to have certain things in place, because it's not just going to be, when you look at countries that have opened borders and reduced restrictions at 80%, they haven't just done it based on vaccines. There is still social distancing. There is still actually a clear need for rapid antigen tests in Australia that for some reason we are years behind, and I don't understand why. So that needs to be implemented broadly. We also need to have better use of things like monoclonal antibodies. So if people do get infected, there is therapies there available for quick treatment. These are all things that I would consider in addition to the vaccination rate as to whether or not we're ready to open.
Excellent. While I've got you, we do have a member's question around vaccines and some of the myths, truths getting around there. Are all 3 vaccines built on the same technology? I heard AstraZeneca was very different to the other 2. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, that's correct. So of all the myriad of different COVID-19 vaccines, there's different technologies used. So Pfizer and Moderna use an mRNA technology. So this is the newest technology. And this is, I guess this is the first time in an outbreak we've seen this technology used, but it's very, very effective, and it's based on decades of research. The AstraZeneca vaccine is based on slightly older technology, although it's not old technology, where basically they've taken a harmless virus, engineered the virus to express one of the proteins of the coronavirus, and then the body is tricked into thinking that, hey, I've been infected with this coronavirus, when in fact they've just got this harmless virus carrying a protein of that virus. This is relatively new technology, but this is actually the same technology that was used to roll out in the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, and that was the vaccination strategy used there. So they are different strategies and different platforms. And that's why we see different complications. So we see a blood clotting complication with AstraZeneca that we don't see with the mRNA vaccines. And that just simply reflects the different technologies used.
So I've also read that in Europe, they've been crossing the streams, giving people a different vaccine. And I had a question earlier there. Am I going to get a better protection from getting even a third booster shot from one of the other vaccines?
Yeah, so this is something that we've known in vaccine development for a long time. And this has been actually the cornerstone of HIV vaccine development, which is a virus that's very, very hard to vaccinate against. We know that mixing and matching vaccines typically, and I'm talking about mixing and matching platforms, typically gives you a better immune response than if you stay with the same platform. So what I would suspect is that probably we're going to have mRNA boosters for individuals who need boosters. And that's actually going to be particularly beneficial because the individuals who are most likely to need boosters are those who are older adults, those who have underlying conditions. So those individuals who probably were first vaccinated with AstraZeneca. I mean, it would be fine if they had the Pfizer vaccine first. It would still work beautifully. But if you happen to have had the AstraZeneca first and then you get an mRNA booster, you're just in a slightly better position.
So are we likely to end up needing a repeat vaccination every year? Do we know the longevity of the vaccines at this stage?
We don't know that at this stage. I personally think, well, what you see now in the US and the UK is that they're boosting vulnerable populations. Israel is boosting everyone, which I don't think is probably necessary at this stage. The data is suggesting that over time, the efficacy against hospitalization and protection against death stays really good. But what does seem to go down is your protection against actual infection. So this then becomes, the booster question is a very complicated question because potentially if you boosted everyone, you may actually have a better effect on transmission, and that would be really good for the society. But how do you weigh that up with the ethical obligation you have of boosting a population when in Africa, with the exception of South Africa, about only 1% to 2% of the population has been vaccinated. And that's not only bad from a humanitarian point of view, but any place you have a raging COVID outbreak, you have the risk of new viral variants emerging that can then come back across and evade the vaccines. So to do that balance is very, very difficult. So I would suggest at the moment it should be targeted boosting for those vulnerable populations and the younger individuals until we have actual real data that it's waning in these individuals. It's not justified.
Okay, thank you. Gareth, I've got a question from a member here. I'll put it to you. And there is a lot of misinformation out there. I wish everybody in Australia could listen to Dr. Short explain this because you'd be left in no doubt. Now, how do we overcome that misinformation and educate our workers and the public on the benefits of the vaccine and counteract a lot of this misinformation that's in platforms like Facebook and other places?
That is a great question. And I think more of this, if I'm being straight to the point. I made the statement earlier on, you have to rely on experts. An expert is not somebody, some keyboard warrior sitting behind a screen somewhere. It is someone that comes with professional background and understanding of the situation. It's who we all rely on in our professional and personal careers, and I see this as being no different. And I think the more we have these conversations, we've done for our teams similar mechanisms to share our thoughts and not our thoughts, but the thoughts of experts such as Dr. Short. And I would really encourage more of this to counter, well, the opposite of an expert.
Can I just add to that point? One of the things that baffles me about this misinformation is I look at what I'm an expert in, and I've literally spent my professional career in infectious disease, emerging viruses, pandemic preparedness. Like, this is what I do. But if it comes to doing anything with wiring electricity, for example, building a house, anything along those, I'm completely hopeless. So there is no way I would do a quick Google and be like, how do I rewire my house? Okay, I've got this down, and then go try it. It's just not how it works. I would go to an expert, and it's no different in a medical situation. We have experts in our society for a reason. One of the other things that I would just advocate is one of the tools that we've been developing is actually an online risk calculator for people who can go in and enter in their age, their sex, eventually their comorbidities, and then what the rate of community transmission of COVID is in their area, whether it's Delta. And then it will tell you what your risk of getting COVID is, what your risk of dying from COVID is, how that changes if you're vaccinated, and how that relates to other risks we have in our daily lives. So, our risk of being killed in a car accident, which is something we probably don't think about on a daily basis, but it's still a risk. So we're also developing these risk benefit analysis tools that we hope will help the public better understand the benefits of vaccination.
I think one of the issues there is you're an expert in your field and you recognise the benefits of expertise in things like electrical, but unfortunately the same 5% who don't believe in vaccines also don't believe in using an electrician to do their wiring, and we do have issues.
So they're unvaccinated and electrocuted. Great.
Unfortunately, they do exist, and there is significant licensing rules and everything around covering off that issue. It's a really good parallel. A last question just come in from a member about natural immunity. Once I've had COVID, do I develop a natural immunity, and should I then go on the register as equivalent to having a vaccine, and will that protect me from coronavirus forever? How does that work?
Believe it or not, this was my morning's work, taking notes on this exact question.
Excellent.
So I am now fully across all the literature. So natural immunity will provide you with some level of immunity to reinfection and reduce your risk of severe disease if you get COVID again. What the problem is that natural immunity looks to be inferior to vaccine-induced immunity. It looks to probably wane quicker, and it looks to be much more variable. So actually one of the studies that we're doing, and it's still early days, but we're looking at natural immunity in people living with obesity. And it's looking like in people with obesity, natural immunity to the virus wanes much quicker than vaccine-induced immunity, than immunity in healthy individuals. When you then think about the proportion of our society that's actually overweight or obese, that's a lot of people. So yes, there's some level of protection from natural immunity, but no, you should not depend on it because it's too variable and it's not as good as that from the vaccine.
Excellent. Thanks for that expert advice. I'm going to bring Nerida back in. You've got off lightly so far, and we've got some great questions. One from our New South Wales member about an office-based employer's told us they cannot get vaccinated and cannot wear a mask. That's remarkable. At what point is it safe to bring them back into office for them and for our staff? So it's really the impact on an unvaccinated person in their workplace. And would it be best to approach this employer if they cannot work from home from 1 December, which is the rule in New South Wales? How do you see that one?
Yeah, so the assessment of it really, and it comes down again to a risk assessment. So as of 1 December in New South Wales, the expectation is that there will not be the differentiation between vaccinated and unvaccinated outside of those higher risk industries. Nevertheless, an employer may still make a decision that it is an intolerable level of risk to have unvaccinated people in the workplace. They might look to apply additional controls like a mask. I think in these circumstances, there's a couple of decisions to be made. That is, what are we going to do post 1 December? I think a lot of employers are just watching and will be reassessing their position as of 1 December. You have to deal with individuals as they come and their medical conditions. You can, and there is precedent for this with the Fair Work Commission have said, you can actually look and interrogate the medical evidence that you've got before you. You don't just have to accept everything before you. And these issues, again, will develop as Kirsty said. Rapid antigen testing is very limited at the moment, but we are expecting that some of the approvals for that will open up, and that may well change. There might be a bit of a hybrid approach to some of these workers.
Couple of quick ones thrown at you on the list. Is it reasonable for you to require a customer to produce proof of vaccination to work in their home?
Again, that's a really tricky issue. So for some of our employers and some of our businesses, yes, that's absolutely what they'll be doing. And we're seeing that in pubs. You know, a lot of pubs are saying it doesn't matter, as of 1 December, we're going to continue this rule and we're going to have this in place. But it is much trickier. Obviously, you can't necessarily issue a direction to somebody who is not in your employment. There will be issues where you've got individuals, you know, trying to enforce these requirements who might be subject to customer aggression, for example. So again, that needs to be another issue that's worked through. A lot of employers have looked at this risk and said the best that we can do is protect our own workers, you know, but it depends on the type of services you're providing and whether you're actually able to do that and whether you want to as well.
So I got another query about a potential fake COVID passport. And how does an employer deal with if they suspect an employee is trying to put one over them to get around the rules?
Again, I mean, there are employment implications if we're being provided with, you know, fake evidence that somebody is vaccinated. Again, this is hopefully an issue that will resolve itself as states move towards having their Medicare information linked up with their apps, but it's certainly an issue we are seeing arising. But, you know, an issue like that, if you're being provided with fake evidence and you do know that it is an employment issue and it is something that employers can look into.
Excellent. And I got one member who's just confirmed about the balance of having a worker getting an on-the-spot fine for being unvaccinated, or the risk of getting an injury from the vaccine. I think I know which way I'd prefer, and I think I know what your answer is going to be. But how would a small employer balance up some of those risks?
Yeah, I think the risk of vaccine injury liability really needs to be calibrated. The Commonwealth Government has stepped in to pick up some of that risk. So in the usual course, if there's a public health order in place, we would expect that a claim for vaccine injury would go through that no-fault Commonwealth scheme. But I would say in that scenario, the risk to the employer of you know, a significant claim from vaccine injury is fairly low, and we will see these rules being enforced in Victoria.
And finally, are we breaching any Privacy Act for asking for vaccination status? I'm sure you've been asked that before.
Yeah, again, a big question. Yes, you can ask for vaccination status. You've got to have a legitimate reason for doing so. You have to work through whether you're asking that employee to provide that information by consent or whether you're requiring them to do it. And you need to make sure that at the time that you ask for that information and collect that information, they're provided with disclosure about the use of that information, and that we have data protection to make sure that any consent or requirement is actually complied with in the way that we store that information. Vaccination status is sensitive information under the Privacy Act, and it is subject to higher protections than the usual, which apply to personal information. So absolutely make sure that you've worked through the privacy issues before you're asking for it.
Thank you. Look, there is plenty more queries there. Unfortunately, we're probably not going to get to all of those workplace situations. I will let members know that Wednesday next week, we are having another webinar with our own Jordan, who will answer more specific questions. So I'm not going to get to all of them. We have exceeded our time, but I want to just stretch it a bit more to just put one more question to each of you, if I can, as a bit of a wrap up. And sorry to all the members that I haven't completely answered all your questions, but Dr. Short, if I can just paint a picture into the future, and if we can look ahead into a year's time, when hopefully we've got high vaccination rates and hopefully being fully open, where do you think we'll be with the virus? Is there a risk of other strains or other developments? Will it be a thing of the past around that time?
This is all going to depend on what happens globally. So we talk a lot here about the situation in Australia, but if we just get the vaccine rates up in Australia and we let COVID run rampant throughout various parts of Asia, throughout South America, Central America, then we are going to get more variants emerging and they will threaten our vaccine-induced protection. So I'm hoping the next stage, once we get vaccinated, will be a targeted global effort to get the vaccines to those who may not be able to afford them or those who are difficult to reach in a vaccine program. And that is how we end COVID.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Nerida, precedent seems to be set with some sectors requiring vaccinations to work, such as healthcare. What long-term changes to workplace laws do you expect to flow from this current environment?
I think that there won't be a general precedent set. You know, there really is a limitation on what is lawful and reasonable to ask an employee to do, and tribunals, courts understand that this is an invasive procedure. You know, it is a big ask, so I don't think it will change that position, but we are hoping to get some clarification of the limits of what we can require our employees to do, so that there is at least certainty for business when they're asking employees to vaccinate.
Excellent, thank you. And Larry, final question to you, mate. As we start living with COVID more in the future, what role should our leaders play? Surely we can't keep up this daily press conference from premiers every day forever. There has to be a switch to situation normal at some point in time. You're on mute, sorry, Larry.
I think the most important thing leaders have got to do is to maintain public trust, and you know that the vaccinations it's essential and that it's effective. So I think that communication and the delivery of the vaccination program is really critical to maintain trust. It's going to be reliable. You know, we've got good institutions that are delivering it, our procurement's in place, and we've got the right regulatory agencies. So I think that's really important, and we're seeing that now by different jurisdictions in the Commonwealth, you know, putting a lot of those ads on TV now, just trying to encourage those who are very reticent, let's say. And I think also that leadership goes to the media as well, and National Broadcaster and many others, because I think a lot of fear has been put into people because this constant reporting. So as far as a daily reporting, well, we saw quite an unusual step by the new Premier of New South Wales recently, where that seems to be ceasing. So I think that'll happen almost, well, probably instantaneously now in New South Wales. But I think the most important thing is maintaining trust, and that really comes from the top. And if that can be done, then those who are reluctant to be vaccinated will eventually be vaccinated. There'll always be a percentage of the population that'll choose not to. But if that figure, as others have said, if you can get up to 90% or higher, that's a good outcome.
Excellent. Thanks, Larry. And finally, Gareth, Schneider, Clipsal, a very big player in the Australian marketplace. How can we use that to influence others in the industry to lead towards this safer environment going forward?
So I think I'll touch on what Larry has said, is trust, is building trust, and trust comes from transparency and good information. So we're committed to doing that. We're committed to working with our customers, with our suppliers, with extended supply chains to make sure that we're all doing the right thing for each other, that we work together on the issues of what healthy and safe workplaces need to be like, but also productive and effective and trustful workplaces need to be like. So I think there's a matter there that collectively we can take a leadership position on, to our extended networks and be a voice for reason in all of this, Malcolm. So I think if we take that posture and working with peak bodies such as yourselves on good information being passed through on such topics is the right approach.
Thank you very much. Look, we're well over time, so I will wrap it up. I'll look on behalf of the membership. I really do want to thank you, Dr. Short. If every contractor and every person across Australia could spend an hour in your life and see what you do on a daily basis and understand the real facts around what we're doing, I don't think we'd have any of the hesitancy we currently see. So I really want to thank you for your insights and the expert information you brought to the table today. Thank you very much. The same for you, Nerida. I think the workplace situations you're dealing with, and as this evolves, you're going to be very busy in the next couple of years, I perceive, resolving some of these issues. So I really want to thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Larry, your expertise in the political world, I think you're right on spot there with what needs to happen moving forward around trust and communication to get all the country on the same page. And maybe we'll get a clear year in next year when there's no elections underway, which can actually give us a platform to all work together for a period of time to get through this. And Gareth, thank you very much for bringing that workplace perspective and the employer perspective to the table. So on behalf of the members, thank you all for participating and providing such a high quality level of information. For the members, this is being recorded. I would encourage you to share it with other members and other people in the community to understand some of the real facts around what is out there and what we need to do as a community to get through this. And for the members whose questions I didn't get to answer today because of time, please tune in next Wednesday, because I think most of your questions could be answered by our own Jordan, who's a resident expert on these workplace relations issues, and take you through some of those scenarios as well. So on that note, I will thank everyone. I will wind up the webinar and appreciate the expertise you've all brought to the table and shared with our membership. So thank you very much, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.